Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Asghar Zaidi. I am Vice Chancellor at Government College, University, Lahore. I like to welcome you to the first virtual conference on emotions and the subject of history, organized by our newly established Institute of History at Government College, University, Lahore. As you know, emotions have a history in time, and they undergo various transformations by invoking, creating, and negotiating with different social, political, and cultural discourses. In the last 2 decades, the study of emotions has become an important subject for historians to study past societies. Historians have used various different methodologies and theories to understand the history embedded in emotions and history created by emotions. In this virtual conference, speakers will discuss different themes within the context of emotions that are related to religious violence and events, Sufi shrines, colonial encounters, medieval monasteries, and relationship between reason and emotion in the generation of new knowledge. We are indeed very grateful to all the speakers of this virtual conference, and I am quite confident that our students and our faculty will be able to draw strong insights in the importance of emotions in our culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zaidi. Our first scholar is John Corrigan, a distinguished professor of religion and history of emotions at the Florida State University. Professor Corrigan will present his paper titled History, Emotions, and Religious Intolerance, in which he will talk about religious violence and emotions from the historical perspective.
Greetings, colleagues, and thank you to Ali Dawud Ul-Rehman, who invited me to share some of my thinking about history and emotion. It's an honor and a pleasure to be able to do that. The title of my lecture is History, Emotion, and Religious Intolerance. I want to talk about religious violence and emotion from a historical perspective. In doing that, I draw at times on the work of other scholars, and in a few places I've borrowed the words of those scholars in making a point. In the interest of time and narrative flow, I'm mostly not going to identify sources as I speak, with a few exceptions, postponing most of my gestures of gratitude to those scholars upon whom I've drawn to footnotes in my forthcoming book. I also point out in advance that while much of my previous work has been in a fairly standard history of emotions frame, I'm attempting in this lecture to recuperate some theories about feeling that have not been well integrated in current history of emotions research, in the hopes that it will prompt a broader and more interdisciplinary work in this coalescing subfield. Religious violence is enmeshed with political and ethnic difference. It is historical and collective. Its rhetoric is a composite that incorporates political argument and the contentious images of ethnic conflict with theological ultimata. Acts of religious violence historically are appalling for their cruelty and brutality. In some instances, they are enacted in complicity with the state, and in others, they are differentiated from the state. Religious violence can be the fruit of careful planning by well-orchestrated groups. In other cases, those groups incite it, but do not tend to its details. Religious violence has a long history of multifarious modes and systems. In order to understand religious violence, the historical perspective is crucial. That was the opinion 20 years ago of Walter LaCour in his book, The New Terrorism, and it is a widely shared view today. The current historically inflected study of religiously inspired terrorism has developed in the wake of a handful of important studies in the late 20th century, including David Rappaport's 1984 History of Terrorism in 3 religious groups, namely the Hindu thugs of the 7th to 19th century, the Muslim assassins from the 11th to 13th centuries, and the Jewish zealots Sicarii of the 1st century. One important theme in this work has been the focus on ideology as key to the historical backgrounds of religious terrorism. As Bruce Hoffman wrote also about 20 years ago, groups transform abstract political ideologies and objectives into a religious imperative. Violence is not merely sanctioned, it is divinely decreed. While agreeing in part with that statement, that is, that political ideologies are involved, I also want to critically address it, and will begin to do that by recognizing that such thinking is part of a broader academic effort, which began in the late 20th century to understand conservative religion, and especially fundamentalism. Driven partly by a series of volumes about religious fundamentalism published in the 1990s by the University of Chicago Press, scholarship digging into fundamentalism portrayed its strong tendency to see matters in terms of black and white, and its inclination to literal interpretation of religious texts. Fundamentalist religion was said to be Manichaean dualism, with sharp boundaries between the saved and the sinful. And its strong moral and cosmological dualism was a theological perspective enforced by a staunch authoritarian leadership. As an absolutist ideology, it constructed a world clearly divided into good and evil, light and darkness, righteousness and unrighteousness, so that at its heart was a binary or dualistic way of thinking and an absolutistic way of knowing, albeit one that was complex. In a fundamentalism understood as a matter of hard binaries, absolutism, and literalism, language played a crucial role. Fundamentalism, above all, was a radical discourse, a cognitive exercise that privileged language and rationality. Scholars took fundamentalism as word-based, rational knowing that divided the world into good and evil, us and them. It was a rigorously policed discourse that did not allow improvisation. Because words rule in fundamentalism, it was a decidedly cognitivist style of religion, in a sense what one scholar has termed the left brain's attempt to do religion. Its simple binary structure with black and white contrasts posited only the in-group and the out-group. Fundamentalism, as preeminently cognitive religion, nevertheless, due to its rigidity, was at the same time, ironically, what has been called a religion of impoverished cognition. Research on fundamentalist religion provided a platform that embedded analysis of language, logic, text, ideology, and processes of identity construction, all of which are detectable in the performance of religious violence. But I venture here an interpretation that foregrounds history and feeling rather than ideology. I take away from theories that privilege cognitive structures in theorizing religious violence, bringing forward instead interpretation of its emotional dimension. In so doing, I in no way intend to insinuate that emotion and cognition are entirely separate realms. Emotions, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on context and background, are joined to cognition. But apart from often unanchored assertions about fear and hatred, as if those feelings arise fully formed from the provocations of language, the study of religious violence has neglected emotional practice. And by emotional practice, I intend an understanding of emotion largely as physically performed, culturally bred behavior. For an individual, it is behavior by a body that is situated in historical frameworks that train and discipline that body, infusing it with social structure and cultural specificities. I want to pivot us then to thinking about a certain kind of feeling. Specifically, I want to speak about trauma. A steady flow of scholarship about trauma has taken historical research in new directions in recent decades. Today, there is general agreement that scholars increasingly have utilized trauma theory in historical interpretation to an extent that trauma has become established as a unique way of appropriating the traces of history and one of the dominant modes of representing our relationship with the past. The development of trauma theory, undertaken in a wide range of academic disciplines, has been influenced especially by researchers' recent engagements with the Holocaust and other genocidal violence in Armenia, the Belgian Congo, Uganda, the Balkans, and Cambodia, among other places. Trauma scholarship was clustered initially around a therapeutic approach to trauma. That therapeutic approach, which consequently influenced the work of historians, was indebted specifically to the emergence of paradigms for conceptualizing post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, that were developed in concert with medical programs for treating traumatized individuals. The diagnostic term post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition now broadly applied to psychological trauma patients, arose in clinical practice involving soldiers returning from war. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association, in referring to the psychological state of Vietnam War veterans, began to call it post-traumatic stress disorder. That action led to the coalescence of trauma studies as a subfield intersecting a range of academic specialties. While initially focused on the experience of the victim, trauma studies began to broaden in scope to address the trauma of the perpetrator. The return of American soldiers from Vietnam prompted discussion about the psychological predicaments of those who had killed. In the mid-1990s, clinicians treating Vietnam veterans described symptom patterns recognizable as PTSD, but they also dug into the psychology of killing itself, searching for ways in which to understand how killing led to such psychological suffering. That inquiry into the pain of traumatized war veterans soon was followed by study of non-military perpetrators of violent acts, including homicide. In those studies, evidence likewise began to accumulate that reinforced the theory that serious psychological problems followed from the trauma of being violent. A cohort of researchers took note of the presence of PTSD in civilian murderers, just as others were digging into the trauma suffered by Vietnam veterans. They eventually concluded, as did studies of veterans, that such civilian perpetrators could develop PTSD. Rachel McNair, in surveying research on violent crime and wartime killing, coined the term perpetration-induced traumatic stress to identify a cluster of psychological consequences experienced by persons who had a history of that kind of trauma. Those consequences included anxiety, panic, depression, a sense of disintegration, amnesia, and the inability to recall clearly the traumatic event. In the wake of the war in the Balkans, mass killing in Rwanda, and large-scale atrocities in other places, that is, as genocidal violence became a more urgent concern, researchers looked closely at perpetrators' histories as they pursued answers to questions about the instigation and execution of genocide. Did the PTSD of perpetrators, indeed, the PTSD of communities that had perpetrated violence, haunt them in a way that led to more violence? For one leading scholar, Irvin Staub, the answer was clear. Participation in mass violence also creates trauma, he said, adding that those who execute genocide routinely engage in atrocities. This is where the history of emotions comes in. The history of emotions as an interdisciplinary area of study that already conjoins research in psychology, philosophy, literary studies, history, sociology, and certain other of the social sciences, is well situated to offer a point of view about trauma, its repression, and its role in recurring violence, and especially recurring religious violence. I want to propose how, by saying a bit more about trauma, about the feeling of trauma specifically, and about the historical transmission of trauma. Research on trauma is strongly influenced by Freud's ideas about memory and its repression. For Freud, the traumatic event was forgotten, buried in memory. But after a time, it surfaced in a way that resulted in psychological difficulties and physical suffering for the subject. What matters for us here is what trauma feels like when it reemerges. And for that, we can also reference Freud, whose writing on what he called the uncanny can help us with language that conveys something of the feeling of trauma. Freud wrote of the uncanny in 1919 as that which arouses dread and horror. It was a special form of the terrifying that took its power from repressed memory. Freud gave many examples of that: castration anxieties, a severed head or hand, dolls, a fear of the return of the dead, of being buried alive, a sense of being in the womb, dread of demons and the evil eye, and the haunted house. In essence, the uncanny set a person adrift between a sense of the familiar and unfamiliar, a feeling of knowing something and not knowing it, a feeling of recalling something but not being able to remember it. For Freud, the fear that a person feels when experiencing the uncanny arises from a sense of familiarity coupled with unfamiliarity, a sense of being present to the object and at the same time alienated from it, of comprehending yet not comprehending. It is the paradoxical experience of the other within, that which is there in the house but cannot be comprehended by it or integrated into it. The uncanny is both an epistemological predicament and a matter of strong feeling. Let's hold on to that understanding of the uncanny as a profound and terrifying experience of in-betweenness, while we turn for a moment to what we think are better known, more easily recognized feelings. Scholarship about religious violence typically holds that it is prompted by hatred. Sometimes the assumption is that an ideology that divides the world into black and white, irretrievably separating us from them, is directly responsible for inculcating hatred. In some cases, scholars have argued that those extreme ideologies directly incite fear and hatred that lead to violence. There is evidence that tracks such a process, at least part of the way. The preoccupation with boundaries and the rigorous policing of them, the depiction of boundary crossing as a critically dangerous transgression, and a belief that even the smallest of illicit incursions into the group will result in a catastrophic collapse. Those things together might play a role in raising the stakes to a level in which fear abounds. But such an understanding of how groups go from ideology to religious violence, for all of its intuitive appeal, does not attend specifically to the question of how fear actually arises or what exactly that fear is. There is a gap in interpretation between the claim that ideological preoccupations with boundary frame opponents more clearly as other, and the actual genesis of the fear that eventually manifests in acts of violence. More specifically, theory has a difficult time moving from discussion of ideology, language, representation, and words to the feelings that are said to fuel acts of religious violence. A mechanism is imagined that translates ideas into feelings. And while it has always been the case that we must explore in that direction. The study of religious violence has not concluded its work in that regard. One question that remains open is, what do people feel, and why do they feel it when they engage a religious ideology that describes the world in hard binaries? Another different kind of question is, are persons attracted to such absolutistic ideologies because they already are in a state of anxiety? Research on religious violence has analyzed how knowledge about one's place in the world, articulated in seemingly crystal clear statements of belief and doctrine, in binary language grounded in literal readings of holy texts, all joined under a coherent ideological umbrella that defines the world with absolute certainty, is a frequent contributing factor to religious violence. In the words of one researcher, there is a certain state of mind that, conjoined with cultural and group processes, leads to fundamentalism, and with further developments, to coercive and violent fundamentalism. Hallmarks of this state are a sense of utter certainty, a feeling of being in the right, hermetic consistency, and highly rhetorical reiterations of truths. The simplification of complexities into binary oppositions, basically of good and bad. Certainty about radical social differences in such a view is a problem that leads to violence. But again, a question arises as to how a group that believes that it has cracked the code, that it has figured out the design of the world and conformed its social order to a supposed eternal truth, how does such a group come to feel fear? Is such a highly ordered, carefully controlled social world of a religious group inherently threatening to those who have created it? Martha Nussbaum, echoing Aristotle, observed recently that people don't feel fear if they think they control everything important and cannot be harmed. More pointedly, social psychologists often report that ideology reduces uncertainty. If that is true, certainty about the world, about one's place in it, would signify a sense of control. So why fear? Maybe it is not fear, precisely, that we should attend to in thinking about all of this, but something less obvious, something subtle. One possibility is that we consider how trauma threatens certainty. Trauma, which is present but hidden, felt but unrecognized, real but in some ways unrepresentable, is a presence that haunts a person or group. Such persons or groups, it is said, are unable to integrate that trauma into their cultural identity, and at the same time, they can never let go of what has happened. It becomes a monster that haunts them unceasingly. And it primes a group to embrace a rigid, sometimes absolutist ideology as a group strives to recover its balance. It destabilizes identity, throwing into question familiar ideas and orders. To put a finer point on this linkage between trauma and uncertainty, for members of perpetrator groups, collective trauma represents an identity threat. It can compromise group cohesion and threaten a disintegration of the group. Unsure of who they are and fearful because of that, perpetrator groups consequently attempt to construct a defensive shield that will protect their group identity, and they do so in various ways, including by minimizing the crime, denying that the violent events took place, refusing to accept the relevance of the past. Nevertheless, in spite of the tactics deployed by perpetrator groups to minimize and forget what they have done, as traumatized groups, they typically still stumble in effecting that process of forgetting. They stumble in trying to forget what they have done. A perpetrator group, whatever its crimes and whatever its seemingly practical solutions to resolving its social identity, suffers from uncertainty arising from memory that will not die. A group may try to deny that a crime took place. A protest that is launched as much for advancing one's own effort to forget as it is a rejoinder to condemnations made by victim groups. But their role in something atrocious haunts them. Digging deeper into this problem, we can see that uncertainty about social identity is in fact a major part of the anxiety in perpetrator groups. It is enfolded in the feeling of the uncanny or dread that arises from the struggle of the group to repress trauma. That feeling of the uncanny arising from repressed collective trauma is felt as the anxiety of being caught between forgetting and remembering, a disorienting position that undermines social identity, diminishes a sense of belonging, and sometimes prompts desperate measures to recover meaning and purpose as a group. In the community of feeling, a way of talking about the collective emotion experienced by a group, there is collective trauma. That collective trauma destabilizes collective identity and prompts recourse to radical ideologies in a group's bid to restore a sense of order, belonging, and purpose. In other words, groups are motivated to reduce uncertainty, and the higher the level of uncertainty, the more motivated they are to reduce it. Felt uncertainty is a powerful self-integrity threat that thrives on lack of closure and a concomitant sense of collective invalidity. In uncertainty identity theory, the person or group experiencing such a threat adopts defense mechanisms, creating a so-called worldview defense in order to manage the uncertainty and restore a sense of group identity. Because uncertainty is highly anxiety-provoking and stressful and leads to feelings of impotence and inability to predict and control the world, persons experiencing that uncertainty will sometimes resort to highly ambitious, even extreme measures in order to set things right again. That effort to compensate includes aggressively positioning the group vis-a-vis others in an effort to clarify group identity. In some cases, the uncertainty-related self-integrity threat leads to a worldview associated with terrorism. The collective campaign to resolve uncertainty in such cases is driven by a complex of psychological processes that, as social psychologist Michael Hogg has observed, under certain circumstances produce extremism out of uncertainty, transforming feelings of uncertainty about who we are into violence. Religion plays a role in many such instances as groups turn radically intolerant and construct theological platforms for holy war. In summary, so far then, anxiety about identity arising from uncertainty is an anxiety about what is not known, an anxiety rooted ultimately in an uncanny experience, the traumatic experience of being caught between remembering and forgetting the past. A perpetrator group, having failed to digest a crime it committed, experiences trauma, and it feels the consequence of that as an anxiety about what the group is. The perpetrator group is emotionally fraught and endeavors desperately to restore identity. It does so in many cases through defensive maneuvers that can take extreme forms, as the group embraces absolutist ideologies and leverages those ideologies in ways that advance its self-defense. There is a paradox in this process of trauma destabilizing certainty about social identity. Oddly, the trauma that haunts a group, in fact, fosters the construction of identity even as it threatens it. For some groups that suffer it, collective trauma, in fact, becomes the epicenter of group identity. Collective trauma can bind group members into effective communities. Trauma generates emotional cultures, and through its representation, constitutes bonds between individuals, binding them to the group. Traumatic events, in that sense, can build social and political communities in which new forms of identity emerge, based not on the attractiveness of the future, but on the horror of the past. Group trauma, collective trauma, is transmitted intergenerationally. There is such a thing as a transgenerational collective self, a construction that can arise from memory of collective trauma transmitted by carrier groups within a population. Collective traumas can remain alive over centuries as descendants of a traumatized group are unable to fully process what is deposited in them. Those deposits accrue interest through their rehearsal in public performances, by rituals that recover and remind of knowledge of the past. Such political rituals, including most notably religious rituals, are particularly effective in fostering transgenerational transmission so that the memory of violence, especially in its affective dimensions, may be transmitted beyond the generation of witnesses. Because cultural practices contribute to the large-scale dissemination of feelings, such ritual performances, along with a wide range of other practices, ranging from movies and books to art, architecture, calendar keeping, gossip, pilgrimage, and religious ceremony, remind persons not only of the traumatic event, but of its emotional consequences. Such cultural practices animate the present with emotion. Some remembering is born cognitively, in words about the past or in images of it, or even by auditory cues, or by other means that are effective in reminding of the event through the repetitive reactivation of the cognitive representation. But again, that reminding is also an emotional matter. Bodies performing together, making the same movements, singing a song together, dancing or marching amount to collective emotional gatherings. And this synchrony leads to an important social sharing of emotions. The emotional aspects of remembering are as important as the cognitive. For all of this, let's keep in mind that scholars often rest their understandings of religious violence on invocations of fear and hatred as its causes. It is a simple calculation. A group becomes increasingly angry as it embraces an absolutistic ideology, and that leads to violence. It is true that hate and fear typically are present in some measure, although sometimes less than might be predicted, in violence between groups. But if we are to speak of hatred, we should recognize that hatred is not the root cause of violence. Rather, it mediates affect. It is a socially and historically constructed emotion that shapes affect into a nameable feeling, something recognizable for its performative character within a social group. What is crucially important is that in some cases, that core affect, the raw material of hatred and anger, arises in connection with the repression of trauma. In these kinds of circumstances, the same can be true with fear, and it is necessary to parse the genesis of fear a bit more here. With regard to fear, we additionally can distinguish fear of an actual opponent, another religious group or ethnic community, for example, from a different kind of fear, the fear that arises from uncertainty about identity. That uncertainty can lead to embrace of ideology that constructs other groups as threats. If the anxiety is particularly severe, the ideology will be more chiseled and inelastic, and the possibility of violence more likely. Recent international relations scholarship has made important contributions to this kind of approach to understanding emotion and religious violence. Fear, anger, resentment, hatred, all play their roles in collective violence. Such feelings, to a certain extent, can be transmitted through society and across generations as part of a broad circulation of affect, in the same way that trauma in general can be transmitted. That is, there can be a collective fear orientation that moves through the group. By the same token, as Emma Hutchinson has shown, feelings of trauma circulate within groups represented in media images and historical narratives, moving through a collective and sometimes tenebrous and unpredictable ways. Thus framed, it is possible to see fear, as international relations scholar Andrew Ross has written, less as fear of X and more as an unsettling anxiety, a kind of disruptive affectual malaise. When we conceptually steer away from rigid definitions of emotion and towards more general transfers of emotional energy or circulations of affect that can take a variety of forms, we can entertain an understanding of fear, hatred, and anger as related emotions, all taking shape within specific cultural moments as they coalesce from a more primitive anxiety. More precisely, we can leverage for the investigation of collective emotion the idea of core affect that Lisa Feldman Barrett and James A. Russell speak of as free-floating feeling that can be swiftly marshaled as anger or fear based on information available to perception. Fear, for example, is the result when core affect is conceptualized using knowledge of emotion, effectively what a person knows from culture about the category of hatred or anger or fear. In their words, in an instant, conceptualization proceeds efficiently and automatically, transforming internal sensory information from the body into a psychologically meaningful state by combining it with external sensory information about the world and situation-specific knowledge of emotion learned from prior experience. The result is a state that is at once affective and conceptual. That is, to put it in very basic terms, it is both emotional and cognitive. A step further, we can envision how historical and cultural contexts at any given time will direct such affect into ideological commitments, social investments, and the positioning of the society towards outgroups. The anxiety arising from repression of trauma as something akin to, but perhaps not exactly, core affect, can supply the effective force for the experience of fear, hatred, anger, and resentment that cluster around it, as those feelings are variously clarified as social and cultural circumstances shape their mediation in images and narrative. I return here to the discussion of religious violence. As a historian, I am concerned primarily with how perpetrator groups repeat their crimes, with what the historian of the Third Reich, Robert Galately, has termed serial genocides, in which a perpetrator group aims to aggress again. Such serial genocides include the Crusades as a religiously legitimated, centuries-long sequence of expeditions to destroy Muslims, the 500-year campaign of Europeans to exterminate Native Americans, also ordained by religion, and the even longer Christian war against Jews that culminated in the Holocaust. Like those, recent genocides in Africa, the Balkans, and Southeast Asia were ongoing campaigns by perpetrator groups whose denials were the signs of what was yet to come. Denial, writes one scholar, is the final stage that lasts throughout and always follows genocide. It is among the surest indicators of further genocidal massacres. Like serial killers who find release and relief from the anxiety of identity problems by committing another homicide, a perpetrator group experiencing trauma can manifest problems with identity that also lead, in a general way, to further violence. Again, I'm interested in the cycle of violence, namely, how killing begets killing, how and why perpetrator groups continue to enact violence against those whom they already have battled. When some Poles who had engaged in the mass killing of Jews in Poland returned to their localities in Poland after the war, they renewed their murderous anti-Semitic campaigns. They did not do so in retaliation for previous violence against them, but for other, more complex psychological reasons having to do with identity and self-legitimation. The massacre at My Lai during the Vietnam War escalated quickly once soldiers had begun killing civilians, and US soldiers who took part in Vietnam War operations such as Operation Speedy Express and the killings in the Central Highlands by the infamous Tiger Force likewise engaged more readily in killings of civilians, sometimes in large numbers, once they had participated in such an atrocity. Experimental studies since psychologist Stanley Milgram's groundbreaking experiments in the 1970s have evidenced some of the dynamics of increases in aggression among persons, emphasizing that perpetrators continue to kill once they reach a point of no return, at which killing perpetuates itself. There is such a thing as a cycle of violence in which smaller acts of killing lead to larger ones, wherein new episodes of killing follow after a time and in sometimes unpredictable ways from previous ones. Killing, thus understood, constitutes a psychological problem for perpetrator groups, posing a threat to their self-understanding and prompting them to extreme behavior as they struggle to come to terms with their deeds. Perpetrator groups are haunted by a past that can drive them to further killing and to killing that is more spectacular and an enactment of their aggressiveness than even previous instances. Killing appears to perpetuate itself even in the absence of retaliation. Andy Martins theorized additionally that this effect should arise particularly when a killer perceives similarity to the victims. In analyzing recurring religious violence, then, we should keep in mind several things. A perpetrator group can suffer from trauma and anxiety arising from previous violent acts. That trauma can be felt by the group as a kind of uncanny, a profoundly disorienting feeling that undermines a sense of social order and social identity. And responding to that feeling, a group endeavors to construct a worldview defense that often is absolutistic and founded on binaries. The discourse, grounded in radical distinctions between us and them, fosters fear and hate. That hatred can issue in violence, which then would be serial violence. In short, then, the starting point for understanding how religious violence recurs is not the discourse of fundamentalism or the language of absolutistic ideologies. Those are important, and religious violence cannot be understood without them. But rather, the starting point is a feeling arising from trauma, a feeling, a core affect perhaps, that constitutes a kind of affective energy that subsequently is rendered as fear and hatred. Culture, and especially religion, with its characteristic style of picturing the world in starkly drawn ideologies, is the vehicle that can enable the translation of traumatic feeling into the familiar, easily recognized emotions. Religious ideologies, therefore, have a role in precipitating religious violence. But the genesis of religious violence is a complicated one. And it is its emotional components that we must further research. That research is best accomplished through a broad project of historical investigation, in which religious violence occurring at many moments in the past and in many places should be analyzed in order to discover how emotion is involved. As I have stated, My own interest is in recurring violence, but a larger project might discover in examining the emotional aspects of religious violence that the process I have outlined is not limited just to serial violence. If that is the case, I hope that it leads to a fuller understanding of religious violence that can help to guide policies that will interrupt that process and decrease the violence. Thank you again very much for the honor and pleasure of being able to share some thoughts with you.
Thank you, Professor Corrigan. Our second speaker is Hussain Ahmad Khan, who's a cultural historian and the director of the Institute of History, Government College University, Lahore. His presentation is on Pride and Curiosity, British Encounter with Indian Textile Products in the Second Punjab Exhibition. He will discuss how the inanimate objects have power to shape historical discourse of British administrators.
My presentation is on the emotions of pride and curiosity. I will discuss how the textile products in the Second Punjab exhibition changed the British emotions from pride to those of curiosity. This exhibition was organized in 1881 in Lahore. In the larger context of 19th century exhibitions, cross-cultural encounters between humans and things shaped people's ideas and transformed emotions. British curators invoked pride over empire by collecting, exhibiting, and interpreting Indian crafts. But when they encountered Indian products, their pride transformed into curiosity. This intersection of material culture and history of emotions provides us an opportunity to explore the cultural, material, and emotional world of exhibitions. To explain this human-think relationship in the 19th century, I employ Bill Brown's think theory, which addresses the question how inanimate objects enable human subjects to form and transform themselves. Brown differentiates between objects and things. For him, objects perform their primary function, for which they are designed, while things are objects that have stopped their primary function. The craft displayed in the colonial exhibitions were isolated from their context and had stopped performing their primary function. In this context, the British and Indian crafts were entangled with each other. Rereading of historical sources by analyzing emotional vocabulary helps us to access the emotions of people of the past. In the 19th century British context, the term pride stood for pomp and splendor. It was an unreasonably high opinion of one's own superior status. In a good sense, it was an upright conduct or acts of benevolence. Here, I treat pride as a feeling leading to a conduct, act, or idea of one's own superior status that may be for the right or wrong reasons. The word curiosity has changed meanings over time. The medieval Catholic Church considered curiosity a sin and equated it with animal behavior. From the 17th century onwards, secular intellectual circles began to see boldness and curiosity as healthy passion and virtues. Curiosity encompassed not only desire but also objects of desire that were called curiosities or curious objects. When we characterize some object as curious, it could refer to its excellence or elegance. A curious object could also carry negative connotations, such as useless, uncommon, and expensive. What binds all these meanings of curiosity together is the ambiguity that characterizes it, and its ability to destabilize existing categories and identities. The British perceived 19th century exhibitions as spaces where they could proudly display their unique, valuable, and unmatchable possessions. This possession could enable them to guide and control the production, consumption, and trade of crafts in India and Europe. The second Punjab exhibition was organized in Lahore, which was the capital of British Punjab. More than 4,000 exhibits divided in 11 classes were displayed to show the progress in the industry under the Raj. Exhibition remained open for 28 days. The total number of visitors was more than 8,000, which included European tourists and members of House of Lords and the House of Commons. In the exhibition, the British asserted the pride of the patron who wished to protect local craftsmen from European goods. In his address on the opening day, Robert Egerton, the Lieutenant Governor of the Punjab, said that the Punjab, being a frontier province, experienced wars and rebellions for the past few centuries. And the people and the rulers focused on arms and agriculture. It had now found peace and security under the Queen, and it was the time to focus on art and manufacturing. The Punjab exhibition was one such space where British curators asserted the superiority of their knowledge. J.B. Lyall, the financial commissioner of the province, mentioned in his address that the interest of European scholarship led to the revival of Oriental literature, and the interest of Europeans would also encourage and revive the humble efforts of Indian craftsmen. The Muse School of Arts, established in Lahore for reviving art and craft, would have an opportunity to display its progress. His intention was to compare the school's products with the local artisans, to show the importance of British patronage and invoke the emotion of pride. But more assertive opinion reflecting British pride over their knowledge and patronage came from John Lockwood Kipling, who was the principal of the Muse School of Arts. He claimed an Indian in a jail could work better under a British master than as a free workman in the Indian society. To educate the Indians in modern craft, the organizers displayed modern needlework of English ladies. John Lockwood Kipling and his students showed this display to specially invited artisans to emphasize the best and most instructive examples of various handicrafts. Invoked by an emotion of pride over their knowledge and civilizational progress, the British curators used the display to instruct Indian craftsmen and visitors. In colonial exhibitions, the policy of giving prizes was based on British pride in their knowledge and experience of judging the objects of merit. The jury nominated in the exhibition comprised British civilian and military bureaucrats and their local allies. Their objective was to point out ill-understood adaptations or thoughtless imitation, disposed to award prizes to purely negative and traditional designs. A prospectus for the exhibition written by a British bureaucrat and art administrator, Baden Powell, provides us with clues of British pride in their knowledge of Indian crafts. The prospectus which the colonial state approved contained information about local crafts that served as a guide for collectors and outlined the British intention to reject, revive, and promote various crafts for local and overseas markets. For instance, to fulfill the responsibility of reviving the decaying craft, Baden-Powell stressed collecting cheap style of shawls and old specimen of Persian rugs and carpets. He proposed to display Kashmiri silk to inspire weavers in the Punjab. As policy guidelines, the colonial state sent Baden-Powell's prospectus to a three-tiered structure for making arrangements to collect and exhibit objects. This three-level structure consisted of a central committee, district committee in each district of the province, and local committees in each tehsil of the province. I will mention two examples to show how individuals in the Central Exhibition Committee had pride in and admiration for superior European civilization. Baden-Powell believed that Indian craftsmen had no ability to understand and explain their craft practice in theoretical terms. So their craft was a cheap copy of European craft. Only Europeans could help Indians by educating them in science. John Lockwood Kipling proudly mentions Gandhara sculptures in his journals, which he thought represent the Greek-Indian interaction and the efforts of Greeks to introduce art and culture in India. To him, the Brahmins and then the Muslims suppressed the local sense of perceiving reality, resulting in a monstrous and unnatural form of art. Kipling believed that in the same way that Greeks helped the Indians, the British would also help Indians in developing and reviving their artistic traditions. Like medieval kingdoms, the British adopted a strategy to legitimize their rule through cultural grandeur. Colonial exhibitions were spaces where the British could proudly display their possessions. The colonial state circulated a notification reflecting the local elite to contribute indisputable Oriental specimen, remarkable for quality of design, color, skill, workmanship, historical importance, and valuable as object lessons in art. The goal was to display old Oriental patterns to educate craftsmen and public who seldom saw such objects. This possession and display of exhibits, even though on loan, was a means of establishing superior status of the British over local patrons, as the latter could never be able to collect and display such valuable objects on such a grand scale. Now I will discuss how this emotion of pride was transformed into curiosity in the second Punjab exhibition. One characteristic of this new feeling, that is of curiosity, was that it challenged the existing categories and preconceived notions about Indian culture. This unique feeling led the British into an unknown territory where their prior knowledge did not help them to make sense of the objects they encountered. Exhibition publications show that the junior viewed objects which they had never seen or thought about before, and the organizers were not expecting such collection. Kipling in his report mentions that the exhibition brought many branches of industry which before were but vaguely known. Most of the individuals in the juries were British civil and military officials, English ladies and native gentlemen. They had little or no exposure of the style and type of exhibits which were on display. We do have Baden-Powell as an exception, who had written on Indian arts and crafts, but most of the British officials judging Indian craft had no prior knowledge of the exhibits. For example, a report on cotton textile reflects how the jury comprising British bureaucrats and their wives struggled to suggest improvement in unknown exhibits. The English ladies on the jury had limited access to Indian craft and craftsmen and were mostly wives of British officials. Many of them accompanied their husbands to protect them from going native, as was the tradition in English middle-class families. After the War of 1857, the image of an Indian male emerged as a rapist and plunderer in Victorian literature, which probably changed the ways English ladies visited local markets and interacted with Indian males. The English ladies interacted with craftsmen through their Indian servants, which limited their information about crafts. Like their male counterparts, these English women also experienced curiosity in the exhibition, which we see through examples of Alice Kipling and Flora Steele. Alice Kipling was in charge of the textile section of the exhibition and had very limited exposure to Indian crafts till 1881. Although adventurous by nature, she could not adjust to the Indian way of life, its weather, and hierarchy within the British community in India. Alice Kipling's report, reflecting her voice and sentiments of other members, shows that the British encounter with Indian textile products contested their preconceived notions. Alice believed that regions such as Hisar, Rohtak, Sialkot, and Hazara were unsophisticated. This idea was probably borrowed from colonial bureaucrats who regularly interacted with her. But the fine exhibits from these districts invoked curiosity. She viewed woolen chops of Hisar as having good texture and designs that were remarkably effective and novel, showing a combination of stitches. Similarly, Rohtak was so excellently presented in color, design, and work, all admirable. In the category of Phulkari, the variety of Hazara needlework was greater than any other, and designs were novel and the choice of colors was invariably good. Two craftsmen of Amritsar sent Phulkari on white clothes, which for Alice and others was the most beautiful specimen of needlework in the whole collection. The British claim of a scientific knowledge shaped by observation and experiments became subservient to this feeling of curiosity. With no criteria set for classifying old and new designs, Alice relied on her feelings and guesswork. Sometimes referred to as female Rudyard Kipling, Flora Steele had limited exposure to Indian crafts. Arriving in India in 1868, Steele learnt local languages. However, in her novels and short stories, she shows no empathy with India. Mostly published in 1890s and after, she advocates the civilizing mission of the British Empire and uses racial categories, asking English women to avoid unhygienic Indian cooks. She represented Indians as backward, a peoples who opposed modern reforms. Despite leaving behind a wealth of literature, she did not write on Indian crafts. In the exhibition report, she mentions collecting samples of embroidery during her visit to various parts of the Punjab, but does not indicate any encounter with local craftsmen, leading us to believe that her husband's staff interacted with craftsmen and shopkeepers. Flora Steele wrote a separate note with the jury report, which enables us to understand her curiosity about the color and design of the exhibits. The colors used for Phulkari exhibits from Lahore, Delhi, Hoshiarpur, and Amritsar amazed her. She struggled to classify modern and primitive colors of Phulkari. To be modern, she suggested a hard and fast rule that no colors except green, yellow in two shades, crimson, white, black, and dark olive green, should be used in Phulkari on silk. She suggested this because she had not seen work other than this, and these colors were easily available in the market. As for the design, she says, nothing to reform. Some are perhaps scarcely worth the labor entailed in working them. In the jury's reports, the expressions of surprise, curiosity suggest a continuous struggle of the organizers to understand local cultures. Due to this reason, they often showed reluctance to comment on the exhibits. Theoretical knowledge of art, which the British claimed to possess, could not help them in grasping every piece of art and craft. These expressions of surprise, curiosity, and interest draw a line between British knowledge and the local cultural domain, defining a space where the colonial state was not able to control its utilitarian interest. My conclusion. In the second Punjab exhibition, the British officials and exhibits were entangled with each other. The British set up a large exhibition in an attempt to possess the objects as a legitimizing tool by invoking the emotion of pride. In the pre-exhibition correspondence and publicity material, patronizing pride shaped official discourse. However, during the course of the exhibition, the emotion of pride over possessing things transformed into curiosity as the British encountered the vaguely known objects. The objects overpowered the British and invoked an unexpected emotion of curiosity, leading them to think as they had never thought before. This encounter challenged the British claims to have monopoly over scientific knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. Albrecht Diem, our next scholar, is an historian of late antiquity and Middle Ages at Syracuse University. In his paper, Regulating Passions, Emotional Discipline in Early Medieval Monastic Rules, he will discuss the regulation of passions and feeling at the monasteries. He argues that early medieval monastic rules not only provided outlines for organizing communities, behavioral norms, and disciplinary measures, but also aimed at controlling, repressing, and fostering emotions.
I would like to thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this event. My name is Albrecht Diem. I'm an associate professor at Syracuse University, and I'm specialized in the history of early medieval monasticism in the Latin West, particularly the study of early medieval monastic rules. In my presentation, I will analyze 3 Latin monastic rules written in the 6th and 7th century with an eye on emotions. What can we learn about the emotions of the authors of these rules? How are emotions conceptualized in these texts? And how do these monastic rules aim at regulating, that is, repressing, guiding, or fostering certain emotions? Giving monastic rules a place in the history of emotions and reading them as emotional texts sounds counterintuitive. After all, we are dealing with lists of norms on how to organize monastic communities, how to organize the monastic space, daily tasks, liturgy, and how to punish transgressions. There seems to be little space for emotions. My observations are based on 3 premises. 2 of them are based on Barbara Rosenwein's work. The first is simply that words matter. We tend to gloss over emotional terms, assuming that they are conventional and meaningless. There is not much affection in addressing someone with dear, and there is not much fear in saying I'm afraid. One of the things I learned from Barbara Rosenwein's work is that these terms nevertheless matter and that they form part of a shared emotional language. Once we scan monastic rules for emotional terms, they will be all over the place. Second premise is that different groups develop their specific emotional language, forms of expression, ways of communication, and rituals that constitute them as distinct emotional communities. Exploring these emotional communities has a double benefit. It teaches us in a much more sophisticated way about the history of emotions. They are socially constructed not only within certain cultures, but in distinct groups within these cultures. Reversely, looking at emotional communities opens a new door towards understanding the nature of these communities. In my case, they vastly enhance my understanding of the diversity of early medieval monastic life. My third premise is influenced by the work of the American sociologist Early Hochschild. Hochschild proposes, on the basis of studying airline stewardess, that they, by consistently smiling and acting cheerfully, create in themselves a cheerful mood. She called this practice emotion work, a way of shaping and channeling emotions for the sake of commodification. I would argue that the authors of early medieval monastic rules envisioned a similar form of emotion work, not for capitalist profit, but as a precondition of keeping monastic communities functioning and attaining their ultimate goal, to achieve eternal salvation. My first example is the Rule of Benedict, or Regula Benedicti, a monastic rule written in the first half of the 6th century in a still thoroughly Romanized world. So what we see in this rule can still be considered an offshoot of classical Roman thinking about emotions. Yet eventually, more than 200 years after it was written, the rule turned into the central norm of monastic life in the Western Christian world and a cornerstone of monastic identity. Monks and nuns today still follow the Rule of Benedict. And it's remarkable that the English word rule, in the sense of the rule, not to rule, appears for the first time in the context of the Rule of Benedict. The text is thus the grandmother of all rules. The Regula Benedicti begins with the famous words Ausculta, o filii, precepta magistri, listen, O son, to the precepts of the master. Benedict presents himself in the prologue of his rule as a loving father, pius pater, who speaks benevolently to his disciples. His calm tone belies, however, the urgency of his teaching. Monastic discipline and monastic conversion is, according to the rule, a matter of life and death, or rather of salvation and damnation. following the rule as a means is a means of preventing God, who is enraged by the monk's sins, from, as I quote, handing over the perpetual punishment those who have refused to follow him into glory. The prologue of the rule of Benedict refers to a very emotional God who needs to be feared as a father who shows disappointment, is angry and enraged about the misdeeds of his children. God is a traditional Roman paterfamilias who claims full rights over life and death of each member of his family. In other parts of the rule, though, Benedict describes God as showing the emotions of patience and love. Benedict's objective is to teach his monks the fear of God and of eternal damnation. His most important statement on the issue of fear appears in the chapter on the 12 steps of humility, which forms the core of Benedict's monastic program. The first step of humility consists in unceasing fear of God, in awareness of the prospect of damnation and salvation. I quote, "The first step of humility, therefore, is that placing the fear of God before the eyes at all times, one should altogether shun forgetfulness and always remember everything God commanded, so that he always turns over in his mind both how hell burns those who scorn God for their sins, and the eternal life is prepared for those who fear God." Yet, having moved upwards through 11 more steps of humility, the monk will reach a state where fear can be left behind and love takes its place. So Benedict says, therefore, once all these steps of humility have been ascended, the monk will soon reach God's loving kindness that, once perfected, drives out fear, through which all things that he practiced before in fear, he will begin to do without any effort and as if naturally by habit, no longer in the fear of hell, but instead in the love of Christ, through both good habits and delight in virtue. This is what God, working through the Holy Spirit, will graciously show his laborer once he is cleansed of vices and sins. Fear is thus not a good in itself, but a disciplining tool and a necessary concession to imperfection. Love, to the contrary, is not just an instrument, but an unequivocal good, as long as it's not erotic love. A monk has to love God, but also show love to his fellow monks and to his superior, or as a superior to his subordinates. But he also needs to love, amare, what he's supposed to do, such as fasting and being chaste, and not love, non amare, or hate, odire, what he should avoid, such as loquaciousness, laughter, quarrels, or following his own will. Monastic discipline is, as we learn here, also a form of emotional investment. Loving to do the right thing is just as important as doing the right thing. Aside from these central emotions of fear and love, Benedict addresses a broad range of positive and negative feelings and passions. Benedict mentions all these virtues and vices listed here at some place in his rule, but his main concerns are the feelings of pride, superbia, and sadness, tristitia. Superbia manifests itself in the abuse of power by those in leadership positions. Aside from that, Benedict addresses the superbia of those who do not want to accept reproach and punishment and those who resist order. Sadness, tristitia, which is almost as prominent as pride in the rule of Benedict, plays an ambivalent role, as it already does in the works of John Cassian. There is good tristitia, good sadness about one's own sinfulness or about the suffering of Christ, and this good tristitia should be performed, especially in the monk's prayers, with groans and tears. God himself is, after all, saddened, contristatur, about the monk's wicked deeds. But there's also this destructive tristitia, a structural unhappiness with one's life's conditions that in itself may not be morally reproachable, but nevertheless indicates that something is wrong, either in the community or in the monk himself. Benedict's strategies against this unhappiness show an important aspect of monastic order, which we might classify as positive discipline. He offers rarely threats of punishment or incitements of fear, but he's concerned about creating circumstances that prevent discontent, frustration, and uproar. For example, everyone should receive what he needs so that no one in the house of the Lord is saddened. Goods should be divided according to need, and those who need less should not be saddened. The weak should receive help in the kitchen service so that they do not fulfill their task in sadness. The sick should be thankful for the service rendered to them, lest they sadden those attending to them. If the monks have to do agricultural work, they should not be saddened. A monk should not be saddened if a gift sent to him is given to someone else. The abbot needs to comfort the excommunicated monks lest they be overcome by sadness. Though positive discipline should work against the emotion that causes discontent and unhappiness, a monk cannot be forced not to feel sad. Yet no one may act out of his sadness by murmuring beneath his breath, and the same prohibition against acting out one's feelings applies to all of the negative emotions mentioned in the Rule of Benedict. Monks are, for example, supposed not to give in to anger and not to waste times in holding grudges, not to hate anyone, or not to love or to love conflict. Benedict also refers to a number of positive emotions that could be understood as remedies against pride, sadness, and anger. Above all, Benedict calls for humility, but he also praises patience, mercy, trust, joy, harmony, modesty, or shame. His strategy of restraining his monks' negative emotions is simple. It consists of admonishment, admonitio, reproach, correptio, and teaching, doctrina, docere, that is, appeals to reason instead of outright punishments. So monks have to learn how and what to feel, and this may have been an essential part of a process of monastic conversion. So emotions need to be learned. In order to fully grasp Benedict's emotional discipline, it's necessary to address what might be considered the mediator between feeling and acting, one's own will, voluntas. It makes sense to draw a distinction between emotions, love and fear, but also pride, sadness, anger, and their virtuous counterparts, which cannot be fully controlled by one's own will, and emotional acts a monk can decide to perform or to refrain from. Anger can be soothed and excited, but it cannot be switched on and off. One cannot force oneself or be forced to love, to hate, or to fear. Yet a monk is not allowed to act out of anger. He has to perform his rightful sadness through tears and groaning in prayer, and he has to express his love to his fellow monks. He's supposed to do what Elie Hochschild calls emotional work. That is, performing emotions with the objective of feeling them. The question of whether and how one's voluntas may be disciplined plays a crucial role in Benedict's monastic program. He seems to be torn between two different monastic ideals and approaching to voluntas, to will. On the one hand, the abandonment of one's own will forms the center of monastic conversion. A monk should surrender his own will just as he renders up all his possessions and turns everything he does into an act of obedience and humility. Benedict is, on the other hand, fully aware that neither the individual nor a community could function if monks were turned into machines that just act out of obedience, but not out of passion and desire. Volition, the presence, absence, and guidance of passion plays therefore a central role in his rule, and he develops a broad and sophisticated semantic field of terms related to motivation and passion, or the lack of it. Three of Benedict's generic terms referring to passion and desire are desire, desiderium, zeal, zelus, and concupiscentia, concupiscence. They appear both in a positive and in a negative context. It is the purpose of the rule and of the loving teacher, the abbot, to guide these emotions into the right direction. Benedict describes good passions with terms such as ardor, favor, eagerness, studium, diligence, diligentia, care, cura, and especially concern, solicitudo, which appears no less than 32 times in the text. Monks have to be emotionally invested in what they're doing. Nothing is worse than not caring and not doing with zeal what one is supposed to do. Benedict describes the opposite of caring with expressions such as desidia, listlessness, tarditas, sluggishness, tepiditas, lukewarmness, inertia, idleness, and especially negligentia, which is the greatest all-encompassing disciplinary problem for Benedict, performing badly or committing transgressions out of lack of caring. Yet, if we ask how Benedict's emotional discipline relates to the ultimate purpose of monastic life, that is the pursuit of salvation, we come, given to the prominent place of emotions in the text, to an unexpected answer. Fear and love are indeed a matter of eternal life and death, but this does not necessarily apply to all the other emotions. Emotional discipline by reproach and by incitement is primarily relevant for keeping the monastery functioning and has thus only an indirect impact on the individual monk's salvation. It is humility, obedience, and the willingness to render one's own will that determines a monk's eternal fate. Much of Benedict's emotional discipline, his emphasis on fear and his insight that pride, sadness, and negligence form vital dangers to a community, have roots in the same classical traditions as modern notions of emotions. Therefore, much of the rule of Benedict makes sense to a modern reader. Yet Benedict's emotional discipline was only one answer to the two objectives of communal religious life: institutional continuity and attaining eternal salvation. The late antique and early medieval monastic worlds produced alternative models, and one of them is laid out in the rule for nuns that Bishop Caesarius of Arles wrote for a community of religious women. Although Caesarius lived around the same time as Benedict, though in Gaul and not in Italy, the expression emotional discipline has a different meaning in his rule. Rather than guiding, disciplining, and teaching emotions, as Benedict does, Caesarius' monastic discipline is in itself deeply emotional. Caesarius expresses in his rule a wide range of strong feelings: the love for his nuns, which he hopes will be reciprocated, the triumphal optimism of having created a rule and a space that protects, by God's grace, the nun's path towards salvation, but also an increasing anxiety that his monastic experiment might fail. Caesarius concludes a summary of his rule by expressing both his anxiety and his optimism, his fear, love, and his hope. So this is a truly emotional statement at the center of a monastic rule. So I read, reflecting in great fear and even in trembling, while my soul grows fearful lest some petty sins steal upon you, I not only counsel these things, the content of the rule, but I even likewise supplicate and admonish you, and with a deep feeling of love, I solemnly warn you, so that you may come without shame in the eternal beatitude to the fellowship of the angels and of all the saints, and so that I may happily come to see you receive crowns of glory together with Holy Mary and with all the other virgins, and to see you follow the heavenly Lamb. I admonish you that with your whole heart and with your whole soul you strive earnestly to fulfill the precepts of the rule included above, through which you may happily attain your eternal reward. The precepts Caesarius refers to largely concern the implementation of a total and irrevocable enclosure, the main feature of Caesarius' monastic foundation. A nun may not leave the monastic confines for the rest of her life. So the rule begins with this provision. These things first befit your holy souls. If a girl, leaving her parents, desire to renounce the world and enter the holy fold to escape the jaws of the spiritual wolves by the help of God, she must never, up to the time of her death, go out of the monastery nor into the basilica where there is a door. A key to understanding Caesarius' enclosure is his reference to the spiritual wolves that roam around the monastery. Those who are inside the enclosure are protected from them, which turns the monastery into a space in which the nun can await the visitation of Jesus with confidence. The assumption that enclosure works makes Caesarius hopeful. The possibility that it might be extenuated or disbanded makes him anxious. Caesarius' enclosure and his idea of the monastery as a safe space determine how he assesses and regulates emotions inside the community. Negative emotions do not form a vital danger to the individual or the community as long as rule and enclosure are upheld. Fear, which was central to the rule of Benedict, especially fear of God, is almost entirely absent in Caesarius' provisions, aside from referring to his own fear. Caesarius does not consider total enclosure as a burdensome act of renunciation of the pleasures of the world, but rather as a joyful escape. His nuns are supposed to desire to enter the monastery and to do so happily, felicita, because they expect to be in a place safe enough to attain eternal salvation. And the term felicita is also all over the place in Caesarius' rule. Caesarius' assumption that the nuns will live happily in the monastery does not mean, however, that he envisions the monastery as a place of complete harmony. His rule indicates that cursing and slander, shouting, arguments, murmuring, and even violence may occur within the community. Yet such incidents do not destroy the monastery or block the nuns' pursuit of salvation. Caesarius condemns them, but unlike Benedict, he does not address the negative emotions that lead to them. As long as the rule is upheld, it takes care of acts of transgression within the monastery. They're not what Caesarius is worried about. While Benedict is concerned about the interplay between his monks' feelings and their actions, we find only one passage in which Caesarius addresses the nuns' attitude and their will, and this passage may be a key to Caesarius' monastic ideal. Nuns are, as he writes, not allowed to enter the monastery immediately, but only after a period of a year in which their will, their voluntas, is tested in various experiments. Only after this period they are allowed to put on their habit and to sleep in the dormitory of the monastery together with the other nuns. Once in closure and the rule have molded the nuns' voluntas, the nuns' will, and their character sufficiently, there should be no distinction anymore between their feeling and their acting. One of the reasons why there are roughly 30 monastic rules preserved, and many more may have been lost, is that questions of how to organize a monastic community, to enforce discipline, to regulate emotions, and to pursue eternal salvations were matters of experimentation, contention, dissent, but also reform. Authors of monastic rules reacted to the works of their predecessors, and the ways in which they altered and rewrote them sometimes show how fundamentally they disagreed with them. In the case of the rule of Benedict and Caesarius' rule for nuns, we are in the fortunate position of having a third monastic voice, a rule that was written roughly a century after Benedict and Caesarius in response to both their concept of monastic discipline and also their emotional discipline. The text, which is preserved under the title Regula Cuiustam ad Virgines, Someone's Rule for Nuns, was most likely written by Jonas of Bobbio, the author of the Vita of the Irish monk and missionary Columbanus, who died around 615, who introduced new monastic ideals, particularly the imperative of monastic life as a life of penance, into the Frankish monastic world. The Regula Cuiustam ad Virgines is not a complete monastic rule that addresses all aspects of monastic life. The text functions only if it is a supplement to another set of monastic norms that are already in place, most likely a supplement to Caesarius' rule for nuns. Jonas used the Regula Benedicti as basis for this supplement, but instead of reproducing Benedict's chapters or just picking the ones he found necessary, he used some of Benedict's practical provisions, thoroughly rewrote them in his own monastic idiom, and provided them with a new theological framework and an entire different concept of emotional discipline. His objective was not to mitigate Caesarius or Benedict's regimes, but to create the most perfect total institution that gave the abbess complete knowledge of the individual nuns' innermost feelings and aimed at controlling and molding them in ways Benedict and Caesarius would never have envisioned. Spatial separation from the outside world, the basic tenet of Caesarius' rule for nuns, remains important in the Regula Cuiustam, but Jonas gives up the idea that total enclosure works. Members of the community may receive permission to leave the inner space of the monastery in order to interact with outsiders. Yet admitting that the monastic boundaries cannot be irrevocably closed has important consequences. The monastery is no safe space anymore. Jonas recognizes that monastic walls cannot fully prevent the devil from entering the monastery or the individual nun. Even more than the rule of Benedict, in the rule of Benedict, the nuns need, therefore, to be guided by constant fear. Not just fear of God, but a very existential fear that even the smallest misstep or just a wrong thought might lead them to eternal damnation. Instead of giving up enclosure entirely, Jonas triples the effort by adding 2 more enclosures to the spatial enclosure that Caesarius of Arles had developed. An immaterial enclosure established by the community and an enclosure of the individual body that strictly controls the boundaries between the individual's interiority, her feelings, and the exterior life, her behavior and her interaction with others. A boundary that Caesarius ignored and Benedict rarely addressed. For the enclosure of the community, Jonas uses the term ambitus virtutum, and this ambitus virtutum, the protective circle of virtue, means that the nuns fortify themselves through interaction with each other in a loving, cheerful, caring, and respectful manner, that they forgive each other's sins, and that they constantly pray for each other. Jonas introduces the ambitus virtutum, the circle of virtues, with the following words. The institutes of the Holy Fathers have determined with how much affection and service of love the souls placed in the monastery should love each other. But it is our task to indicate by which acts or favors it has to be shown. In the end, the crowd of nuns has a very wide circle of virtues, ambitus virtutum, because being surrounded in such a way, they may easily overcome the enemy, that is the devil, who is turned against them. The individual enclosure of the nun means that any interaction between the heart, Jonas calls it the area pectoris, the space of one's heart, the mind or one's feelings, and anything happening outside needs to be strictly guarded and monitored. No word may be uttered without a third person as a witness. Every word needs to be spoken in a cheerful manner. Every gaze and gesture needs to be friendly in a way that may not only discipline or conceal one's own feelings, but also creates good feelings among those who listen or see. At the same time, the nuns need to shield their eyes and ears from anything that may disturb their minds and cause negative feelings. None of the instruments to attain salvation that Caesarius or Benedict propose, leaving the physical world behind, regular observance, good works, unconditional obedience, humility, abandoning one's will, works in Jonas's eyes. He really needs more. So he wants to come up with an alternative to both rules. Caesarius shows little interest in the nuns' feelings. Benedict operates with system of virtues and vices and is interested in emotions to the extent that they might lead to acts that might be harmful or beneficial to monks in the monastery. But Jonas fills the gaps that Benedict and Caesarius left open. He's primarily interested in the nuns' feelings and their interior state, because in his view, it is here where the devil can exert its influence most effectively and where the fate of the nun is decided. Jonas is concerned about the nun's mens, the mind, and heart, the core, the heart, categories that play hardly any role in the rules of Benedict and Caesarius. Jonas writes, so to speak, interiority into Benedict's and Caesarius' texts. It's the state of the mind that qualifies nuns to take on responsibilities in the monasteries. Whether the mind is alert or sluggish, negligent, fervent, reckless, prepared, obstinate, hardened, or loving are questions that need to be permanently assessed. The purpose of teaching, rewarding, consoling, admonishing, reproaching, and threatening is to modify the nun's mind and heart. The state of the mind manifests itself bodily through gestures and the use of the voice. Jonas explains, for example, that even Small movements such as bowing one's head or voicing a greeting not only reveal one's own mindset, but also nourish within the state of the mind those things that do not depart from true humility and love, as he phrases it. That is, they have a direct impact both on one's own mind and those of the other nuns. The overarching feeling that should guide all their behavior is love. Not so much the love of God, but the love of all members of the community. It should guide how the nuns interact, speak, move, care, forgive each other's sins, and pray for each other. This love should, as Jonas emphasizes, by no means express itself in personal affection for an individual member of the community. All fellow nuns have to be loved equally. There is, however, one serious problem with Jonas' total and ideally watertight discipline of the mind, and he's painfully aware of that. It does not create complete safety. The devil may still prevail. Jonas's remedy consists of revealing one's thoughts and feelings in a relentless ritual of confession, which is unique to his rule. We don't find anything of that in the rule of Benedict or in Caesarius' rules. The gates between one's inner feelings and the outside world need to be closed and guarded at all times, but they need to be entirely opened 3 times a day to the exclusive ears of the abbess who hears confession, and not only the confession of deeds, but especially of all activities of the mind. So Jonas writes, whatever the mind or flesh commits through frailty during the dark time of the night after compline must be seen to be atoned through confession after the 2nd hour of the day. But whatever it has committed out of tepidity by deed, look, hearing, or thought at daytime has to be judged at the 9th hour after the service is carried out, so that it be cleansed. But whatever stain the mind contracts after the 9th hour ought to be confessed before compline. One of the purposes of this confessional ritual was to give the rest of the community the opportunity to perform the ultimate act of love, forgiving each other and praying for the forgiveness of sins of the confessing nun. Jonas's emotional discipline is based on the idea that a nun's interiority, her passions, emotions, and motivations determine her eternal fate. He therefore tries to surpass Benedict and Caesarius by developing a form of monastic discipline that directly controls and impacts their feelings, but also limits the impact of their feelings on the other members of the community. It is primarily a discipline that forces the nuns to make every act and every mutual interaction an expression of love. So these are my 3 examples. So how are we going to proceed from here? As I have said, my 3 monastic rules are case studies. I chose 2 of them because they had an extensive afterlife, especially, of course, the rule of Benedict, and the 3rd one because it critically responded to the other 2. One obvious option would be expanding our pool of sources and looking at the other 25 to 30 Latin monastic rules. The result will be that each of them develops its distinct emotional discipline. Communal religious life is, however, not exclusively a Christian phenomenon, and I would expect that at least some of the other religious communities had text-based system of disciplines as discipline as well. So let us expand into this direction. So looking at them might not only give access to different and maybe striking similar systems of emotional discipline, but we could also use the question of emotions as an entryway to exploring how these communities functioned and how discipline worked in general. I know that my own work would enormously benefit from a conversation with scholars who work on religious communities in a non-Christian monastic context, non-Christian context. Another option would be expanding our source material into a different direction. Monastic rules were certainly not the only texts that shaped an emotional community. They functioned in an interplay with other normative texts, with narrative texts, especially saints' lives, liturgical texts, and other religious texts, and certainly also the Bible. So we need to look at them all together. And a last way, which expands a bit on the French philosopher Michel Foucault, would be expanding the notion of discipline and power and how they shaped, gave meaning to, and fostered and limited emotions. Space would be number one of the list. Number one on my list. I assume that monks and nuns were supposed to feel differently in different spaces of the monastery. Space can create anxiety, awe, fear, safety, harmony, and potentially also aggression and competition. Monastic rules, of course, contribute to creating space and giving it its meaning. And I had not talked about this aspect at all, but I think it has a lot to do with emotional discipline. Rituals are shaping, controlling, and fostering emotions. And we know that especially Jonas of Bobbio, in his Regula Cuiustam ad Virgines, was keenly aware of that by submitting his nuns to an elaborate choreography. They had to move in a certain way, they had to move around in space in a certain way. That also certainly is part of emotional discipline. And everyone who ever sang in a choir knows about the enormous emotional impact of singing together, both through the act and through the words that are sung. And I wonder whether we can pin down that singing homophone Gregorian chant has a different emotional impact than singing late medieval polyphony, just as an idea. Our monastic rules played, of course, an important role for all three aspects: the organization and assignment of space, the ritualization of monastic life, and what would I call liturgical discipline, singing with the right voice and with the right mind. So I would consider my exploration of emotions in monastic rules just the beginning, opening a door into the variety and complexity of communal religious life. Thank you very much. And I put out here my email address, and I very much hope that you will contact me if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Diem. Lauren Mancia of the Brooklyn College and a historian of emotions and medieval art will be presenting her paper, Tools for Monastic Emotion, Confessio and Conversio in Augustine, John of Ficam, and the Cloister's Cross. Here she talks about how medieval monks were prescribed emotional redirection through a process of confession from cold devotional feeling to warmed or right devotional feeling. Professor Mancia will also illustrate how even the most devout monks needed both textual and material tools to feel emotionally connected to the divine.
Hi there, my name is Lauren Mancia, and I am speaking from the Department of History at Brooklyn College at the City University of New York. And this paper is entitled Tools for Monastic Emotion, Confessio and Conversio in Augustine, John of Ficam, and the Cloister's Cross. One would be mistaken in thinking that devotional feeling came easily to Western European Christian monks in the Middle Ages. Quite the contrary. Between the temptations of sin and the relentless requirements for constant, potentially monotonous monastic prayer, monks were not strangers to not feeling it, of not being able to feel truly emotionally connected to their divine pursuits. Western monasticism had succeeded in regulating monastic external behaviors, for there was the certain promise of punishment for a monk who did not act according to the rule of Saint Benedict, the will of his abbot, and the customs of his monastery. But the interior feelings of a monk, feelings reflecting a well-directed heavenly longing in all that he did, whether prayer or liturgical practice or study, were much more difficult for others to discipline. What monks therefore needed to be exceptional in doing, particularly in the 11th and 12th centuries, was prescribing a plethora of tools useful in combating moments when they were turned away from God, called perversio, instead of towards him, called conversio, in right devotional feeling. Many of these tools were textual. Still others were visual, performative, or material, requiring the use of alternate modes of bodily perception, likely resulting in a variety of approaches to and experiences of devotional emotion in the monastery. In this paper, I will use a small collection of examples from this single theme of conversion to show how monks proposed a specific process of emotional redirection for their brethren, both in terms of texts they read and objects they manipulated. William Reddy's phrase, navigation of feeling, comes close to what I am describing from scholarship on the history of emotions. Closer still to my ideas might be the dynamic and fluctuating theories of feelings and experiences, combinations of rational learning, sense experience, and emotion, as defined by Rob Bottis and Mark Smith more recently. But none of these modern theoretical constructs are as precise as the medieval descriptions of desired emotional experience that I will describe in this paper. Medieval believers spoke about the process of cultivating devotional feeling, used their own terminology of conversion and confession. And so those are the terms that I will use throughout this paper to explore this particular medieval idea about devotional emotion. I have here chosen to focus on two prescriptive texts and one object to elucidate this theme. I will start with evidence from Augustine's Confessions, a late 4th and early 5th century text that was one of the first to define notions of confession and conversion for the Christian West. I will then move on to explore John of Fécamp's Confessio Theologica, an 11th century text inspired by a reading of Augustine's Confessions and written by a Benedictine abbot for the purpose of outlining the ideal emotional processes of conversion and confession to his monastic brethren. I will then turn to look at how monks beyond Fécamp used these ideas of confession and conversion outside of the realm of the textual, focusing on the famous 12th century cloister's cross, today at the Met Cloisters in New York. Placing Augustine's and John's emotionally instructive texts next to the cloister's cross will help to elucidate the key emotional processes of confession and conversion as presented in both thought and object, albeit from different central medieval monastic contexts. In the end, this study as a whole will work to show how medieval monks might have used both texts and material tools to accomplish their life's chief purpose, to feel connected to the divine. In his autobiographical Confessions, Augustine of Hippo understood that as created beings, humans were mutable in stark contrast with a perfect, unchanging God. Such mutability made humans emotionally inconstant in their pursuit of the divine and in their Christian devotion. Human faith and the emotion that attended it was never static to Augustine. Once converted to Christianity and celibacy in the narrative of the Confessions, Augustine did not suddenly gain confidence that his abilities to pursue the divine would remain constant for the rest of his days. Instead, immediately after Augustine had finally converted, he mournfully remarked on his inconstant faith and longed for proper devotional emotion in the very next chapter of his Confessions. Sometimes you, God, cause me to enter into an extraordinary depth of feeling marked by a strange sweetness. If it were brought to perfection in me, it would be an experience quite beyond anything in this life. But I fall back into my usual ways under my miserable burdens. I am reabsorbed by my habitual practices. I am held in their grip. I weep profusely, but still I am held. Such is the strength of this burden of habit. Here I have the power to be, but do not wish it. There I wish to be, but lack the power. In Augustine's words, therefore, even after his profound experience of conversion to Christianity, the emotional landscape of his own devotional life was fundamentally one of shallow sentiment, sinful habitual practices, elsewhere labored perversio or perversion, and constant longing for an extraordinary depth of feeling towards God that was never permanent. Augustine characterizes the cure for such restlessness and religious inconstancy in this life as a process of unremitting conversion. Despite the English usage of the word conversion today, such conversion was practiced by professed Christians in the Middle Ages and did not indicate a coming to the Christian faith for the first time. Instead, conversion was then the process involved in feeling and admitting to having done wrong and to reaffirming the divine path through awakening to God. Elsewhere, Augustine exclaims, "Let them turn back and convert and seek you, for you do not forsake your creation as they have forsaken their creator. Let them only turn back and convert. See, there you are in their hearts, in the hearts of all those who confess to you." The conversion process was therefore one of emotional correction, a method of reminding, recanting, and rewarming to God and to right prayerful emotion after having strayed from the correct path. Moreover, to Augustine, it was a means of confession that such conversion happened. In the period before 1215, when the Fourth Lateran Council required all Christians to confess at least once a year, monks understood confession as it was defined by Augustine in the late 4th century, not as a sacrament or a ritual, but as an emotional process that required a monk to recognize and internally admit to the sins he had committed, thereby better enabling him to strongly and emotionally affirm, convert to, and praise God. This was a process that was interior. Hear from my own confessions what I am within, where they can venture neither eye, nor ear, nor mind. Confession was thus the means towards proper conversion. In the model of the confessions, such feeling and joy were never permanent. The believer's life was a continual conversion of the individual towards God, an emotional conversion that regularly took the believer up from outside himself, setting the believer before his own face. For the monastic reader, confessions modeled a process of self-confrontation, acting as a mirror that reflected the sinfulness of its reader. The text thereby attempted to instigate confessional emotion and, however momentarily, recalibrate the believer to turn towards God before he inevitably slipped away once again. Chief among those inspired by the emotional processes outlined in Augustine's Confessions was the 11th century monk John of Fécamp, who arrived at the monastery of Fécamp to serve as its prior in 1023. In his chief oeuvre, the Confessio Theologica, John not only quoted extensively and verbatim from Augustine's text, but he also readily embraced Augustine's notions of confession and conversion, adapting these ideas for his own monastic audience and helping to disseminate these concepts to the wider Anglo-Norman world. John's Confessio takes as its central subject the processes required for monks to properly conjure emotionally engaged prayer. The treatise was written because John said he saw that his monastic brethren desperately needed prescriptions to carve out extraordinary depths of feeling in their devotional practices. Here, John uses the first person singular so that a monk could better read himself into the texts. John thereby invites his reader to say to himself, "Therefore, not out of the temerity of presumption, but out of a great avidity of my desire for you, God, I have applied myself to this little compilation of readings for your praise, in order that I might always have a short and handy word about God with me, and from the fire of reading it, as many times as I grow cool, I may be reignited in your love. For since we are placed in the midst of snares, we easily grow cold in our heavenly longing. And so we lack a constant defense, so that after having been roused, we run back to you, our true and highest good, whenever we slide away." For John, the solution to a monk's propensity towards coldness and heavenly longing was a meditative practice of maintaining the fire of emotional action through confession and conversion. Like Augustine's Confessions, John's text served as an intimate script for monastic readers who should attempt to align their emotional rejuvenation with the approach of the Confessio Theologica. Again, like Augustine, John's method was to confess to God, both in the sense of admission of sin and in the sense of praise. John's moments of confession read as conversions from coldness to reignited praise. Pity me, God, pity me. Do not lose me with my sins and my vices, my faults and my negligence, you who do not want the death of a sinner, but rather a sinner who has converted and who lives. Here, John identifies a need for his reader to undergo a conversion to the right devotional engagement and emotion, as a sinful Christian would require. As in Augustine's Confessions, the narrative of John's Confessio Theologica is not linear, but is rather an incessant cycle of confessing, backsliding, and reconfessing to God, a process of continual conversion for humans who place themselves in the midst of snares over and over again. In John's conception, there is never a devotional goal fully achieved. There is only the roller coaster ride of ignition and cooling again and again. There is merely the repeated call of, awake, I ask, awake my torpor, with your prods everywhere and without cease. Like John of Fécamp, the cloister's cross plays with the notion of confession and conversion in its artistic program, albeit in more material terms. The cross was likely used as an altar cross as well as a processional cross at the monastery, probably in southern England. It is through its multimedia and multi-sensory stimulation that the cloister's cross attempted to produce confessional feeling in its monastic viewer in ways similar to, yet distinct from, Augustine and John's textual interpretations of the notions of confession and conversion. On the simplest level, the cloister's cross makes a typological presentation of Christ's passion and the scenes following the crucifixion during Holy Week. On the front side of the cross, seen here, hung the body of the body of Christ, now missing, and I'm showing you where that would have been with my arrow on the screen. Behind Christ's head was the still visible Moses and the brazen serpent. 3 surviving terminals of the cross each depict one of a series of Holy Week scenes: the Good Friday plaque, the Easter plaque, and at the top, the Ascension plaque. And below, Adam and Eve hopefully cling to the foot of the cross, desperate for the promise of salvation contained in the scenes above their heads. Most important to an analysis of the confessional emotions is the image just below the Ascension plaque, a scene of Caiaphas and Pilate arguing about the inscription they have carved on the Titulus beneath their feet and above the head of the body of Christ that would have hung there. The Titulus's inscription is carved in Greek, Latin, and a pseudo-Hebrew and reads, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Confessors. The Titulus is accented by a hand of God the Father, blessing the figure of Christ that would have hung below from its perch on a stylized cloud. Finally, the front of the cross presents a couplet carved in large letters. Again, I'm going to show you with my arrow here, carved in large letters on its front shaft, reading, "The earth trembles, death defeated groans as the buried one rises. Life has been called, the synagogue has collapsed despite great foolish effort." On the 2 sides of the cross shaft is another large inscription reading, "Cham laughs when he sees the naked private parts of his parent. The Jews laughed at the pain of God dying." And on the shaft on the top side of the cross, as if written for God in heaven, reads an inscription in Greek, "Man, Christ Almighty." What are the emotional prompts for confession and conversion located in the cloister's cross? With its citations of scriptural exegesis, the cross's program is so sophisticated, language-heavy, exegetical, and typological that only a monk could have designed it, and only monks could appreciate it. Moreover, the quotations on the cross come from the texts that would have filled liturgies and populated the libraries of most Benedictine monastic houses in medieval Europe. The scenes on the terminal in the front of the cross were familiar to the monks of the 11th and 12th centuries, many of whom themselves performed the same Holy Week scenes in the Easter liturgy when they played the roles of the three Marys at the tomb, the subject matter of the Easter plaque on the left, or enacted the crowd of witnesses to Christ's deposition featured on the Good Friday plaque on the right. In this way, the cross literally sets the believer before his own face, preparing the stage for Augustine's idea of confession and conversion to take shape. The monks saw themselves, their behaviors, their learning in the cross, which thus offered a self-reflective iconographic program. The cross's pursuit of confession and conversion does not stop there, however. Once it allowed its audience members to see themselves, it presented to viewing monks an immersive opportunity to internalize the very frailties of which John of Fécamp and Augustine spoke. It invited the monks to imagine themselves not just at the foot of the cross, but also as unbelieving Jews in need of confession and conversion to Christ for the first time. The chief way the cross does this is with its large inscription written on its shafts, concerning Cham and the laughing Jews. Several scholars have interpreted this inscription as addressing medieval Jews who were regularly being attacked in this period and eventually were expelled from England, Germany, and other areas of Europe soon after the cross's fabrication. While there is no denying that anti-Jewish polemic was intensely inflamed during the era of the cross's production and had very real effects on its Jewish victims, it was highly unlikely that a Jewish audience regularly, if ever, bore witness to an object such as the cloister's cross. After all, the monastic altar was not attended by Jews, but by Christian monks, and the involved Latin and Greek program on the cross certainly spoke the language of Christian monks much more effectively than it did of Jews. I would argue that the cloister's cross was used to teach and perpetuate anti-Jewish polemic against imagined Jews in the minds of the 12th century Christian onlookers. Christian polemic against Jews and Muslims was more often aimed at correcting Christian belief than it was directed at real or imagined non-Christians. Sarah Lipton has shown that in the High Middle Ages, Jews were often used as allegorical stand-ins for the doubting insecurities of Christians. Jews served as indexes of perception for Christians, witnesses who served to represent those imperfections which the viewing Christian could not see in himself. Quote, "It is natural and tempting," Lipton says, to make the link with, quote, "contemporary anti-Jewish texts and to see these images as expressions of the intolerance that came to mark high medieval Christendom," end quote. But she goes on to say that, quote, the primary realm in which these religious images must be understood is the realm in which religious imagery was used, Christian devotion, end quote. Thus, in the practice of monastic penitence, for example, Christian Anglo-Saxon poems likened the state of the sinful penitent to that of the Jews clamoring in the desert, because Jews here served as avatars for Christians who used them to explore their own impious behaviors. It seems likely that, rather than speaking to actual Jews with its inscriptions, the cloister's crosses program invited its monastic onlookers to imagine themselves as Jews, ones who did not fully recognize Christ's divine nature because they had not properly confessed, in the Augustinian sense, to him. How might this thought experiment have worked for the monastic viewer, and to what effect? In their meditations, monks often practiced displacement, forgetting themselves and their own identities in order to achieve replacement and to better have a conversion to a particular devotional practice. Imagining themselves as Jews denying Christ, particularly Jews laughing at a crucified God, as the inscription suggests, would have underscored for Christian monks the offensiveness of their cooled, lukewarm positions, since 12th century monks knew laughter, the opposite of godly reverence, the equal of disrespect, to be forbidden in the monastery. The Jewish position, an imagined neglect of and perversion from the crucified God, hence would have served as an apt allegory of the cold behavior discussed by Augustine and John of Fécamp, who analogously accused unfeeling monks lost in their habitual practices of sin to have forgotten all that they believe. Feeling of coldness essentially turned monks into Jews who had forgotten and neglected Christ. What better way to turn back towards Christ than to re-envision oneself as a Jew who might embrace Christ anew in rapt conversion and feeling as connected to him as a new convert might be? What's more, the cloister's cross explicitly calls such a conversion a confession, much in the vein of Augustine and John of Fécamp. Its Titulus grants Christ the title of King of the Confessors, a complete, unique epithet for the crucified Christ. I have shown earlier in this paper that monks would have understood confession to be the mandated act of admitting their own sins and expressing their own praise of God. Therefore, the cloister's cross's Titulus, by calling Christ King of the Confessors, invites its monk viewers to imagine themselves Jews in order to better confess and convert to Christ in real time. Perhaps they even literally performed conversio, turning around the object as they did so, turning in procession around the cross as they metaphorically turned again towards God in their hearts as well. With the help of the Titulus, therefore, the cloister's cross focuses on allowing the monastic audience to perform as Jews, giving its viewers an idealized opportunity to confess to Christ, to truly emphasize the sinful state of their habitual practices. In so doing, the cross clarifies the ideal emotional processes of confession and conversion prescribed by Augustine and John of Fécamp by literalizing them, by suggesting they happen at the level of transformation akin to that of a Jew's conversion to Christianity. The performative dimension provided by the cloister's cross to further the process of penitential confession and conversion, then, seeks to elucidate these concepts for the practicing monk by immersing the monk in a rejuvenating experience. With the help of their Jewish avatars, monks could better recognize their own sinfulness, more fully complete their conversion, and more effectively reignite the fire of longing for God by performing a confession to Christ. In other words, in the words of a famous medieval image theorizer, Abbe Suger, the monk's, quote, dull mind rises to truth through that which is material, and in seeing this light is resurrected from his former submission, end quote. There is no hard evidence that the author of the program of the cloister's cross knew John of Fécamp's work or knowingly applied Augustine's concepts of confession and conversion. Nor is there hard evidence that the cloister's cross's idealized program was regularly performed and engaged with by medieval monks. But through the comparison of these two medieval texts with the cloister's cross, we can see how these concepts were manipulated in different ways and different media in the 11th and 12th century monastery in order to present an idealized solution, confession and conversion, to a single emotional problem, lukewarmness in the face of God. The Confessions was not just an autobiography, the Confessio Theologica was not just a collection of prayers, and the cloister's cross was not just a typological program of ivory images. All three artifacts were likely instruments for monastic emotional devotional instruction, prescriptions for conversion and confession via text, image, and immersive experience. William Reddy has called emotions speech acts, implying that they are primarily verbal events. But as powerful as the demonstration of verbally articulated emotion is in Augustine and John of Fécamp, the cloister's cross shows us that emotion in the medieval monastery was also likely applied to, manipulated, and practiced with objects. When the stakes were as high as right devotional practice and the subject as elusive as proper conversio and confessio in the monastery, monks bombarded themselves with several different kinds of instruction, constructing a full, multi-dimensional emotional experience in which to immerse their brethren and apply and sculpt their devotional feeling. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Mancia. Ayyaz Gull, a historian of emotions at the Government College University, Lahore, will present his paper on Tears of Mourning, Zuljana, and the Weeping of Shia Community in Pakistani Punjab, 1947 to 2015. He will explore the role of Zuljana in evoking and expressing weeping of Shia community in Pakistani Punjab.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Ayyaz Gull, and first of all, I am very thankful to the Department of History and its organizing team for international conference on history of emotion and giving me a chance to present my paper on Tears of Mourning, Zuljana and the Weeping of Shia Community in Pakistani Punjab 1947 to 2015. In Pakistani Punjab, apart from religious doctrines, devotional rituals and symbols remained central in evoking weeping. This study tries to explore the role of Zuljana, which is the replica of Horse of Karbala, in evoking and expressing weeping of Shia community in Pakistani Punjab from 1947 to 2015. It evaluates the weeping of caretakers of Zuljana during the whole years, weeping of mourners, and it also unveils the weeping of Shia community women while serving food and making various vows during the last 2 days of Zuljana processions. Although Zuljana had a unique significance in Shia devotional rituals, symbolically important and one of the major sources of inspiration for the mourners, the role of horses in religious, cultural and emotion perspective remained relatively unexplored. My study ventures to fill this gap, and it is based on the synthesis of archival and printed sources in Saraiki, Punjabi, Urdu and English languages. Humans made their understanding and use horses over millennia. In the West, horse remained a source of domestic activities, long-distance trade, and military supremacy. Horses were considered machine. A chapter, The Horse as a Machine, in Carl W. Gay book, Productive Horse Husbandry, argues that the best horses were the horses that produce more work with less food. Moreover, the French philosopher René Descartes believed that animals like horse are purely mechanical and incapable of reason and emotions. Generally, the Enlightenment thinkers consider animals only as a source of human, not as something which is not as something essentially important. But in South Asia, horse is used for agriculture, trade, war, and as a religious symbols. In Pakistani Punjab, horse is an integral part of Punjabi culture. A historian of science and medicine, Susan Jones, points out that horses are living communities with cultural values. Horse in Pakistani Punjab is central in games such as polo, tent pegging, and rituals such as horse dance, and for devotional religious performance of Shia community. Devotional rituals and symbols are integral part of all world religions. They are a significant aspect of religious followers' lives, which strengthen their emotional engagement and bond with gods, prophets, and other symbolic religious personalities, and disseminate commune sensibility. They vary in religions, cultures, times, and spaces. They all do not work at the same time, and they can't be displayed simply everywhere. In order to pay attention to the specific deity, person, or relationship, ritual occurring in a particular space acts as focusing lenses. Jonath S. Smith defines ritual is a means of performing the way things ought to be, in conscious tension to the way things are, in such a way that this ritualized perfection is recollected in the ordinary, uncontrolled, and course of things. Ritual symbols are as important as ritual itself. Like ritual, they evoked emotional responses. British cultural anthropologist Victor Turner's theories of ritual highlight symbol as natural elements and artifacts that evoked memories, social connection, and emotional responses. He viewed symbol as basic unit of ritual. While explaining the differences of meaning in dominant symbols and emotions, he further argues in the action situation of ritual, which is social excitement and directly psychological stimuli such as music, singing, dancing, effects and interchange of qualities between its poles of meaning. Norms and values, on the one hand, become saturated with emotion, while the gross and basic emotions become ennobled through contact with social values. Turner understandings of ritual symbol has greatly influenced the study of religious rituals. While writing about rituals, some other scholars such as Emily Durkheim, Clifford Geertz, and Gray L. Eberso consider emotion one of the important aspects of inquiry in religion. Durkheim opines the rituals provide a platform through which the sense of community chosen is encouraged. Geertz is of the view that religion modes and motivations are an important aspect, especially how ritual contributes to the religion influence force in culture. While exploring ritualized weeping, Eberso argues that performative tears do cultural work. So, after driving some data-driven linkages from these methodologies of religion and emotions in colonial Punjab through different devotional rituals and symbols, Shia and shrine-based community evoke weeping and happiness to construct and preserve its identity. Every year, in the first 10 days of the month of Muharram, the Shia community showed a very idiocentric face of Islam by performing devotional ritual. Azadari remained one of the major devotional rituals of Shia community as compared to other Muslim community like Ahl Sunnah community celebration of the birthday of the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him. During the Muharram days, the weeping of Shia community was permanent but relatively different in devotional rituals either in Imam Barka, Shia private houses, courtyards, community centers, or in special ritual centers. Weeping was also relatively different in Shia men, women, and children. Muharram was packed with symbols. Symbols played a vital role in escalating weeping of the Shia community, such as Tazia, Zuljana, Alam, which remained the center of attention during the Azadari processions. Men, women, and children used to weep by touching the horse of Karbala. They memorized the horses of Karbala by symbolizing the horse of Azadari procession. Continuously during the procession, they used to weep by passing beneath the horse, by kissing it, and by associating different vows with the horse. Before exploring the role of Zuljana in evoking weeping of Shia community in Pakistani Punjab, it is important to give a brief description of the history of Zuljana procession in India. The coming of Shiaism in India was one of the most interesting phases of the history of Islam. It was counterfactual that all Muslim conquerors of Indians were Sunnis, but up to the reign of Mughal, mostly the soldiers of emperor and kings in the North India were Shias. Taking Zuljana in Muharram procession was introduced by Amir Taimur in 13th century. After winning battle in Delhi, he announced to take procession of Zuljana among his soldiers, who requested to perform the pilgrim to the tomb of Imam Hussain in Iraq. Akhtar Naqvi in his book Zuljana contends that even before Amir Taimur, the tradition of Zuljana had been established, but as a king, he was the first to take Zuljana procession on the permanent basis. In Lahore, the concept of Zuljana procession was introduced by Nawab Ali Raza Khan Qazilbash in 19th century. Ghulam Ali, popularly known as Game Shah, and Syed Abdullah Shah Bukhari also took the procession of Zuljana before partition. After the partition in 1947, the emotion of fear was very prevalent in Shia community. Fear of losing identity led the Shia community to self-saving behavior. In Pakistani Punjab, fear played a vital role in the construction, rejection, and preservation of Shia community identity. For instance, the fear of losing power in Shia Lucknow Kingdom 1856. The community of Pakistani Punjab also faced the fear of losing its identity in Punjab. Many Shias families such as Naqvi migrated and carried the devotional rituals to Pakistani Punjab. In the second half of 20th century, in order to make its religious identity visible in Punjab, it kept on celebrating or observing all Shia devotional rituals such as procession of Zuljana across Punjab. A Spanish religious historian mirrored the importance of Muharram devotional ritual as an identity marker. Maryam Abu Zahab contends that Muharram remained a vehicle of identity assertion. Muhammad Hassan points out that Muharram was deep-rooted devotional rituals and constitute of Shia identity. Francis Robinson, a famous historian, opines that due to Muharram procession, 12-er Shia community remained visible in South Asia, but in scholarly term, mostly invisible. In Pakistani Punjab, Shiaism survived largely as a religion of devotional rituals. Shia community observed Muharram through devotional rituals in which symbols played an important role. Every year on the 10th day of the month of Muharram, the Shia community showed a very idiocentric face of Islam by performing various religious rituals. Muharram was observed one of the major devotional ritual as compared to other religious sects. It was organized with passions and emotion, and it was collectively showed their identity as a marginalized community. During the first 10 days of Muharram, the weeping of Shia community was permanent, and devotional ritual, either Shia different ritual places were observed. Muharram rituals were filled with devotional symbols such as alam, black flag, tazia, replica of the tomb of Imam Hussain, and Zuljana. Devotional rituals played a vital role in evoking religious emotions of Shia community in colonial Punjab. Zuljana-based weeping was trans-communal in Pakistani Punjab till 1979.
Thank you, Dr. Gull. Yasmin Syed from the University of Barcelona, in her presentation, will focus on the relationship between reason, emotions, and the construction of knowledge.
Assalamu alaikum and hello to everybody. I am Yasmin Syed. I am currently finishing my PhD at Barcelona University, and I am recording this from my residence in Spain. First of all, I would like to thank Government College University Lahore for the invitation to this magnificent global conference. And it is truly an honor for me to partake. A university where I've had the pleasure to teach and where I've encountered true thirst for knowledge like nowhere else. My admiration, love, and regards go to all the teachers, staff, and students. Now, to my presentation. Being an anthropologist, as I am, there is little I can contribute to the history of emotions and everything that will be said here in this conference. What I can do is look at the concept of emotion and expose how, with the advance of modern times, it has been dislodged from reason to scale it as a human behavior not only opposed to reason, but also regarded as less true than any human expression led by reason. I shall start by explaining how this dichotomy came into existence and its implications for the Muslim world, and the consequences that can still be felt today and that need to be addressed. I will explain how emotion cannot be understood without reason, and reason cannot be understood without emotion. Why? Because they are the expression of one and the same truth, whatever the truth is a person believes in. As an example, I will elaborate on the response of the Muslim world to the offenses made in France against the Prophet, and how the Muslim response, far from being an unthought, emotional response, is a response bound to reason and truth, the truth of the Muslim world. A truth many belonging to the European tradition find it hard to accept. So let's look at the dichotomy and how it came into existence. To understand the juxtaposition between emotion and reason, we have to go back in time and position ourselves geographically in Europe and walk towards the Enlightenment period. What happened in that place and time was the transformation of the understanding of the world, the transformation of how the world was ordered. a new knowledge was born that was able to position man at the center of the universe and push the divine to its margins. Man was now in charge, so to speak, and not anymore at the mercy of his divine destiny. But what gave man the impression that that was so? Well, first and foremost, he discovered reason, together with its science. Man was now equipped to control his destiny and that of the world by knowing and controlling nature through reason and science. The consequences of this newfound self-confidence led, as we are all aware, to a revolution not only in the field of economics, in the advances of technology and medical science, but also in the field of politics, where people were now governed by people, and it was the state that was sovereign and not God. And how did man govern themselves? They did so by natural law, by extracting laws through this newfound reason that allowed them to find not only truth, but also that which was right and wrong. And not only that which was right and wrong for Europeans, but that which was right and wrong for everybody. Because his truth was everybody's truth. It was universal. Man was the holder of the truth, and as such, he was entitled to impose it on others. And here comes the interesting bit. If reason was a European discovery, what were the people in the rest of the world doing? Well, they were like children, still deprived of knowing how to reason, more driven by instinct, repetition, and custom, and emotions, of course. That is when the dichotomy firmly established itself as something inferior to reason. And with Europeans having reason, they were superior to the people of the rest of the world who did not think like them. The consequences of such thinking is well known to all of us, and I'm referring to Pakistan as an ex-colony. But this thinking is not something of the past, not at all. I believe this knowledge stands in plenty, and it is therefore imperative to counter it for the sake of all of us. Now, many intellectuals have contributed to put an end to the dominance of this knowledge that contemplates only one type of reason. To make my argument, I have chosen here to use the concept of tradition as elaborated by Tallahassee, which allows us to put the European world I have spoken about on the same platform as the Islamic tradition or the Muslim world, which I figure was Talahassee's intention anyway. Now, before I continue, I want to remind the audience that we are here on a theoretical level, that I am very much aware about the differences that exist amongst Europeans, as much as the differences amongst Muslims, and that nothing is totally black or totally white. But for argument's sake, I will continue talking in such broad terms as European world and Muslim world. Now, if we look at these two worlds, as Tallahassee proposed, as two traditions, both passing on their knowledge from generation to generation, with their understanding of what is right and wrong, and with their institutions to preserve their knowledge and procure their continuity, then we might all agree that both traditions have their own logic, have their own order, and have their own truth. Both exist within their own understanding, which is derived by their own particular process of reasoning. Now, for those who are skeptical and not familiar with the Islamic tradition and still tend to think that it is only the logic of science with its method of delivering facts that can lead to truth, I shall briefly explain the logic and reasoning of the Islamic tradition. The methodology used by the scholars following the demise of the Prophet and for centuries to come was to compile the hadiths by verifying the sources and their honorability. That is, to establish the authenticity of the hadiths, the classical formula of isnad was employed. That goes as follows. it has been related to B by A on the authority of B, on the authority of C, on the authority of D, that Muhammad said so and so and so. The closer the source is to the divine, the more authority it contains, connecting this way the divine with the past and the past with authority. It is indeed a much more complex process of verification, but the bottom line is this: the divine, honor, and authority are connected in a way that they are able to establish truth. And truth is right, and right is honorable. That is the underlying logic of this process of reasoning. It is indeed a much more complex process of verification amongst families, no matter where in the country and throughout the state. It is therefore incorrect to say or believe that there is only one reason or one truth. In the Muslim world, this has been acknowledged forever. For Muslims, the absolute truth only resides within the realm of the divine, and humans can only approach this truth through interpretation. This is why Islamic scholars had no problem with having hadiths with contradicting contents. There is no one truth. This has also allowed for the different schools of law not only to coexist, but also to work together and express mutual respect for one another. So having established this, we can leave aside the discriminatory notion of a Muslim world that does not reason. The next question that needs to be made is, if the two worlds, the European world and the Muslim world, both reason, what is it that keeps those two worlds apart, opposed, and different? To answer this question, we will serve ourselves of the model of legitimacy established by the great father of sociology and anthropology, Max Weber. Though his reference to the Muslim world is more general, calling it Orient, and including other religions, his model still serves our purpose. He compares the European world and Orient with regards to their understanding of legitimacy. How do people from each world understand who has the right to rule, to command, and where is this legitimacy taken from? In Europe, he says, legitimacy is extracted from laws. Laws make sure people follow the mandates of the state. Through the administration of the bureaucracy, laws determine who has the power to govern and impose laws and who not. Now, laws from the European world, as we have seen, are man-made, derived from their own process of reasoning, which relates nature with right and wrong and truth. It was this legal rationale that truly distinguished the modern state that came to being in the West, separating itself from divine law and turning instead to natural law. In the Orient, on the other hand, Max Weber says, obedience is marked by custom and tradition. People obey their elders, the tribe elders, the clan elders, the birs, the landlords, because it has been done so in the past, for years, for decades, and for centuries. The reason here, as we have seen from the Islamic tradition, parts from the basis that past is right, and it is intrinsically connected to honor and truth. And above all stands the divine as the ultimate truth, the ultimate right, and the ultimate good. This argument not only allows us to see the differences more clearly between the two worlds, but it also allows us to understand how the belief in divine sovereignty and the belief that our lives are tied to divine will remains an indisputable reality in the Muslim world. So, we have two different processes of reasoning and two different perceptions of what is true. Once again, I have to stress, we are talking here on a theoretical level, understanding that reality exists not in such absolute terms and is far more complex. But one has to acknowledge those differences, nevertheless, to be able to analyze the reality and the conflicts between the European world, or the West, one might say at this point of the argument, and the Muslim world. And what better example than the provocation made by French journalists and the way they depicted our prophet. According to the reasoning of the European world, men have freedom of speech. It is a natural right that cannot be taken away. As their reasoning tells them that their truth is universal, anybody disputing a natural right, such as free speech, even if it's against the divine, is considered wrong and untrue. According to their reasoning, Muslims don't reason, obviously, because if not, they would agree with them, and if they don't reason, all they are manifesting are emotional outbursts, childish behavior, nothing else. To be more specific, the French foreign minister defined Muslim protests as baseless. For the Muslim world, however, the reasoning is simple and clear. All that is true and right and good is concentrated in the divine, in divine revelation and in his messengers. Going against them is not only dishonorable and wrong, but also it is clear that nobody has the authority to do so. Responding to divine offense is not a baseless response, but a reasoned response, charged with strong emotions, not because it is unreasonable or baseless, but because it is offensive. It is a response to an act that is perceived wrong, dishonorable, and unauthorized. According to many French, and sadly many people in the Western world, there is no offense, which comes to prove the ethnocentric perspective with which this problem, which affects billions of people on this planet, is taken. Now, to conclude this presentation, I would like to say just this. To understand emotions, we have to understand where they come from, the truth that lies beneath them, and the reasoning that brings them into existence. Emotions are bound to reason, and therefore to its logic, to its tradition, and to all the knowledge they carry. Emotions express fear of losing what is right, and emotions express the happiness of preserving that which is understood as right. It is only by accepting that there are differences and differences of processing and reasoning and understanding what is right and wrong that we can find common ground and understand emotions. Thank you very much.
And this brings us to Sheher Bano, our last speaker for today. Sheher Bano is a PhD scholar at the Institute of History, Government College University, Lahore, and she will be presenting her paper titled Tears in Sacred World of Sufi Shrines of Pakistan.
Thank you for having me to present my paper. My presentation is based on the project of my PhD thesis. I will trace the emotion of shrine communities in Pakistan, 1952-2010. Weeping in shrine-based communities of Pakistan during this period represented immaterial objects, ritual performance, and it responded to historical processes. Different historical phenomena such as partition, wars of 1965, 1971, development of technology, and different contrasting religious ideologies influenced and shaped the performance of weeping. In 1947, the shrine communities experienced violence. The role of shrines changed from pilgrimage site to refugee asylums. Weeping as an expression of emotion became more intense at such places. In a similar way, the development of technology derived the concept of sacredness beyond the walls of shrine architecture to the daily life of the shrine communities. Recorded addresses by the custodians of the shrines, qawwalis, and ceremonies were available in visual form. I will discuss the relationship between macro and micro events which shaped the emotion of weeping communities, and affiliation of individuals with the shrine was based on the sacredness, reverence, and devotion, and it provided the economy of emotion of shrine communities. Architecture of shrine, performance of rituals, and state policies towards the shrine-based communities are different aspects which responded to the historical processes. This talk is based on the case study of the Shrine of Pir Meher Ali Shah, which is situated in Rawalpindi, a district of Punjab. Pir Meher Ali was a renowned Sufi of Chishtiya Sufi Silsila. Shrine of Pir Meher Ali as a cultural outpost of spiritual power had been vital source of identity, and affiliated communities patronized it on social basis. Religious and economic bases were also the important insights. I will discuss that how shrine was not only serving as the major site of religious social interaction, but also as cultural threshold which was rich with emotions. As far as existing studies are concerned, the cultural historians have embarked on different anthologies of emotions that explores overall social conditions. A group of historians have focused on the collective emotional experience of community and how different aspects like arts, music, literary aspects during the particular period reflected the emotions of that particular community. The basic framework of the historians provides insights to study the weeping of shrine communities in Pakistan. On the grief and sadness, historians describe the emotions association with sadness, that how they has changed with the time. Historians like Rebecca McNamara, Deborah Lewis, and Thomas Dixon highlighted the perspectives that show the chain expression of weeping and their respective changes at the macro level. Emotional economy of the shrine were contributed by the producers, interpreters, and custodians in a complex system of exchange. Scholars like Zika also delve around the community consolidation through the study of the rituals. The shrine of Pir Meher Ali was built in 1903 and it became a symbol of Muslim unity. The Pir had the strong relationship and a strong ideology towards the Muslim identity. After the formation of Pakistan, the shrine became a solace for the migrants. The location of shrine is close to the Victoria railway station. Therefore, not only the native but also the refugees from the India landed on this shrine. The Pir was highly regarded by a British official and he was invited in the ceremony of George IV, but he denied attending. There are similar examples in his life where he denied the authorities in favor of his disciples. His shrine had been visited by high officials, politicians, as well as people from the marginalized classes. The people who belonged to different sections of society had strong spiritual as well as emotional affiliation with the shrine. My presentation is divided into three parts. The first part is based on the verbal expression of the emotions. Second is with the aspects of emotion triggered by the architecture. And third deals with the intensity of emotion in ritual performance and overall the state policies toward the shrines. The vivid reason of weeping are sorrow, fury, despair, and fear. Number of anecdotes describe Sufi crying in separation of his spiritual guide and crying while departing a place like Dargah. Sufi also used to cry in imitation of his spiritual masters. Sufi justified this apparently non-sanctioned venture with his reference to the fact that the Prophet and predecessor Sufis also wept. Verbally lamenting and weeping in the poetry of the Sufis presented the motive and intensity of affiliation to the spirituality. Weeping in the Sufi writing was highlighted as a sign of sincerity. It reflected a penitential behavior. Tears in the Sufi poetry of Pir Meher Ali acted as highly emotional and religious stimuli, and it triggered responses. In his poetry, he described himself weeping and mourning at the parting in love of Prophet Muhammad and God. Weeping together had been uncustomary, as tears are regarded as something which that has to sort out for oneself. Emotional inner life was not confined to oneself in the courtyard of the shrine. The poetry of Qawwali reflected the importance of lamenting, regret, and sadness. Different genre of poetry of Pir Meher Ali was about the love for God, lament for his separation, and separation from his spiritual guide.
And with this, we conclude our today's conference. We are very grateful to all our speakers today and look forward to having you again very soon. And we also thank our audience for taking out time to join us today. Goodbye.